What you got, Mr. South? Is it long?
Well, I just need to know from Dr. Royster when we're going to have the student assignment brought before the board.
Oh, okay.
October Committee of the Whole.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. So that brings us to the end of our agenda for the Committee of the Whole. We do have a special called meeting following this. We're going to convene for lunch first, and we'll take a 45-minute lunch, which means we would convene at 12:15 if I have a motion to adjourn from committee. Well, I think we're going to adjourn. We'll adjourn anyway. So we'll do 45 minutes, and so we will. Our special called meeting, we will convene at 12:15. All right. Y'all looking?
I think it just says immediately after.
Yeah. Otherwise, we'll start presenting and have to stop for lunch. So I think that's the most effective, efficient way for us to handle that. So do I have a motion to adjourn? Have a motion from Ms. Morrison-Fair, seconded by Mr. Chamley. Any discussion? All in favor of adjournment, please say aye. Any opposed? The motion carries. We are adjourned. Thank you.
I think what you're looking for is already posted on our website.
How's it going?
Good.
Good job.
Okay, it takes a second. So you got open.
Hey, did
Okay. Did I get turned down? Oh, that's really loud. That's louder than it was this morning. Yeah. Okay. So just as a reminder for the board, as part of the Internal Auditing Services Department organizational plan, the board officers of the time earlier this year initiated an external audit just to determine kind of best practices, looking at processes that we have for our internal auditing department. And Green Finney was asked to perform this audit for us, and so they've gone through and done their report, coordinated with Rick on responses, and have that report and findings to present to us today. So we do have a recommended motion from the administration. Would someone like to go ahead and put the motion on the floor before we see the presentation?
Madam Chairman,
Mr. Saylors.
I make a motion to accept the report and findings of Green Finney with the inclusion of responses provided by the Internal Auditing Services.
Second.
All right, I have a motion and a second. So with that, I'd like to welcome our Green Finney folks here to share this report with us. And we'll let you guys run through the whole presentation, and then look at questions from there.
Great. Sounds good. Thank you, Ms. Wells. Good afternoon, everybody. As Ms. Wells mentioned, we have been asked to essentially what I like to say is just perform the procedures we were asked to perform, to provide some recommendations concerning best practices to help internal audit services, and I'm just going to keep saying IAS, and that's what I mean by IAS is the internal audit team services, just to help them to continue to improve and get better and get more efficient and effective at what they do. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm actually going to use the executive summary as the talking points that I'm going to walk through. As I hit each point, what I'm going to do is give a little detail under that point in the executive summary to give you a little more information in terms of what we're recommending. So if you look at item number 1, it says the IS Department Manual is appropriate and contains most of the information that should be included. However, there were several areas that were not up to date when we started our procedures. And essentially, what we found is that IAS had numerous Word documents that they had prepared, as well as some paper copies of their manual. It was a little bit difficult for us to kind of understand what was the most up-to-date. And so all we're simply saying there is best practices would be to simply have one PDF document that's updated at least annually, and it's dated so everybody knows when it was updated, and you can just move forward accordingly. I will say, after we'd finished our field work in April, they did provide an updated PDF copy of the manual for us, and as we were finishing our work. So I think that one's been addressed. Item number 2 really concerns technology primarily. I do want to say that IAS has made some good steps in this area, particularly as it relates to the way they're monitoring pupil activity finances now. However, there were a number of things that we felt like they could improve to become more efficient and effective in terms of how they do their work. The first one would be that what we found in terms of the way they were doing their work is they had a lot of Excel and Word documents in actually performing their work, but then what they would do is they would print out each of those documents and put all of their work in a notebook or a binder and use that to sign off, to review, to document the review and the other things that they did. What we would recommend they do is actually look at some integrated work paper software. It's out there. We've used it ourselves as a firm for about the last 10 years or so. And it would, number one, do away with the paper. It's hard to be totally paperless, but they can be much more paperless in their work. It allows you to document, to review, to do everything you need to do in the software itself, and I think it would just help them to become more efficient and effective in the work that they do. The other thing is that, especially on the internal audit side, but external auditors actually use it quite a bit as well, there's some software out there called data mining software. And what it allows you to do is to do a lot of test work on larger populations than you would be able to do otherwise. IAS has actually had some data mining software for a few years. It's called ACL. They just have not really utilized it much at all. And so I think it's a great idea. They've got it. I think now they just need to be more effective in using it on a regular basis. That's item number 2. Item number 3 regards risk assessment primarily at the master audit plan level as they're evaluating what they're going to do. And there's several different things that we noted here. One is that IAS has developed really good relationships at the school level. I think at the school level, they really use IAS to even, if they have issues that come up, if they have questions that come up, they will use IAS as kind of their sounding board and advisors, and I think they've done a good job on that area. But that doesn't really appear to be the case at the district department level. And as a result of that, I think one of the things that's made it difficult is that IAS gets very little input from the district departments when they are putting their master plan together, doing their risk assessment, and really figuring out what they're going to do. So there's several different things that come out of that process that we feel like they could improve what they do. One is what they're doing at the pupil activity level is good, and I think it's the right approach to take, and they're using technology in that area, which I think is very beneficial. We would love to see them, and we think it'd be a good idea for them to look at taking the next step and doing that with the district overall, the losses system, and doing some continuous monitoring of it that would also help them with their risk assessment and help them really better identify where are those areas of risk that they might want to spend some more time on. I'm going to talk about it more later, but part of the recommendation that we had under this item number 3 with the risk assessment process was to look at going back and establishing an internal audit committee again. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. with another recommendation that we have. And then the other thing that I think it would be good to do, and I know Rick has at least considered this in the past, and that is with technology and IT in general becoming such a more and more important part of the whole risk assessment process, and now today much of the risk is IT related. So we would love to see IS consider their next hire to be a staff audit professional that has some good strengths when it comes to the technology side of things. And obviously there's a lot of benefits that come from that, but just somebody that's stronger on the technology side that would really help them address not only the risk assessment, but the use of software and a number of the other things that come along with that. We also had a recommendation just regarding improving the master plan reporting that they do to the board. And then last, when we talk about risk assessment, not just at the master plan level, but we would just love to see them continue to apply that risk assessment process, which they do some, but we would love to see them continue to risk assess at a project level throughout the project to become even more efficient in terms of how they're doing their work. That's item number 3. Item number 4 relates to the reporting to the board and project completion. And as a reminder, when we were doing most of our work in January, February timeframe, primarily February. So we were looking at 2018, not 2019. And when we looked at the reports for 2018 and the information, the timesheets, and then how that was used to provide information to the board, the hours that were included did not include any of the chief audit executive's time, Rick's time. His was separate. I think he's changed that in 2019, but the reason we think that's so important is, from a board's perspective, we think it's good for the board to see all of the time in IAS and how that's being used. That includes training, vacation, et cetera, et cetera. So with Rick's time, I know one of the things that's challenging for him is some of his time is directly related to projects and some of it isn't. But I think it's still good for the board to even see how much of his time is project related, how much of it's not. He spends time problem solving. He spends time reviewing work papers, reviewing reports. That's obviously project time. And then obviously he has more administrative time than the rest of the staff do. But including all those hours we think would be very beneficial. The other thing that we noted here is that at the time we were looking at this, IAS was pretty behind at the project level compared to what was on the master plan. Now, obviously we understand there's all kinds of reasons for that. Emergencies are going to come up. If fraud happens at a school or something, they're going to go jump on that project, and so things change. I think two things there. One of the things we recommended is that maybe they needed to look at reevaluating the master plan and stepping back from adding new projects or as many new projects until they were able to get caught up on the current projects that they had. Then the other piece of that relates to, which I think this is an issue that involves the board, the district, and IAS, and that is just the timeliness of projects getting completed. And our overall feel, and there are each individual project might have had different reasons for why it was taking more or less time, but the overall sense that we got is that at the board level, at the district level, and at IAS, there wasn't a real strong sense of urgency of once we start a project, let's make sure we're doing what we need to do, but let's get it done. And so it's not just IAS's issue. It's not just the district's issue. It's not the board's issue. I think it's everybody together. We think it would be very wise to just everybody culturally develop more a sense of urgency of once IAS has drafted a report and has recommendations, whoever the auditee is should make it a priority to go ahead and respond and review and do what they need to do. So whatever kind of back and forth needs to happen before it gets presented to the board, that happens in a more timely fashion. We feel like everybody it'd help IAS be more efficient. Obviously, the district department or whoever's getting audited wants to get it done, and obviously the board's getting that information more timely. That's number 4. Number 5, we did look at the audit work papers on 9 specific projects. And I will say that overall, in terms of the work papers, what was documented, what was done, we feel like IAS is doing a good job on that end in terms of the actual work itself. Item number 6, IAS every 5 years, based on the international standards, is supposed to either do a self-assessment, and then that self-assessment gets reviewed by an independent outside CPA firm, or they can do an external assessment. And what IAS has done in the past is they've done the self-assessment and they brought a firm in to review that self-assessment. We feel like IAS would benefit greatly, since it only happens about once every 5 years. We feel like AIS would benefit from having an external assessment. However, if you bring a CPA firm to do that external assessment every 5 years, I know that can get more costly. So one of the things that we're actually recommending is that IAS look at finding another school district that is in a similar situation, has an internal audit department, and share services. So have that district come do an external assessment of IAS, and then at some point in time, IAS can do the same thing for the other district. Probably save some time, save some money. At the same time, you can both learn from each other, and I think there would be great benefit from that. That's number 6. Number 7, this is where we specifically talk about the internal audit committee, and we feel like having an internal audit committee would give a little more oversight to IAS, which we feel like would be beneficial. This committee would still report to the board, so ultimately, obviously, the board still has overall authority. A couple things that we identified. One is that, and I've got it in one of the later items here, but in the evaluation process, one of the board responsibilities is to evaluate Rick, the CAE, and there were years where that evaluation was fairly robust. There were other years where it really wasn't. It was weaker, and we didn't feel like it was really that great of evaluation. We feel like an internal audit department is one way that would give a little more oversight, not only to IAS overall, but probably do a better job on the evaluation end with Rick in terms of responsibility for doing that. And we just feel like, from a cultural standpoint, with the urgency and some of the other things, that an internal audit committee would be something to consider in terms of driving that urgency and creating that kind of culture. We did note the last item that's on there, we actually went out to a lot of other great city schools that also have internal audit departments and did some analysis with all that. One of the things we did note, you're never going to be able to compare apples to apples with that stuff, but one of the things we did note, and from talking to a couple of internal audit directors from some of those schools, most of those districts did have internal audit committees, and the folks that we specifically talked to felt like there was benefit from having that internal audit committee. That's number 7. Number 8, we kind of looked at the overall of employee evaluations and how that worked. Number 1, they're getting done, which is great. We see a lot of places where the evaluations aren't getting done, so evaluations are getting done at IAS. However, what we saw, again in 2018 and I think a couple earlier years, was that those evaluations of the staff are basically the staff's doing a self-evaluation, and then the CAE and the supervisor are adding some comments, maybe some goals to that. We feel like it would be a much better evaluation process if the CAE would himself prepare an evaluation for the supervisor and the staff, and the supervisor for the staff, as well as a self-evaluation, and probably some more meaningful dialogue and some better things that might come out of that. I've already talked about the board evaluation process and how we feel like that could be a little bit stronger in terms of evaluating the CAE. And then we also noted that sometimes staffing's been an issue within IAS. The time we were there, they just had they had the CAE, the supervisor, and then one staff person. So one other thing that we recommended is that there are probably opportunities that may exist, as depending on the projects, where maybe it makes sense in order to stay on track with what they want to do in terms of the master plan, is to look at outsourcing every once in a while as an alternative, especially when they don't have the staff that they'd like to have. Number 9 really just regards training. We were also asked to look at how they do their training. Number 1, they're doing it. The staff are going to training every year, which is great. What their practice has been up till now has been that all of the staff generally go to the same training. We think that best practices where they would really see much more benefit is to have one staff person, whoever it might be, go to a training, come back and train everybody else. If all the staff are doing that, they're getting a lot more input, a lot more learning going on, as opposed to everybody going to the same training. Now, having said all that, I know a lot of the things that I have mentioned, there are dollars associated with that. And I know from talking with Rick and Lee that at least I think they have felt some constraints on the budget side of things in terms of spending money, and that's why they've done some of the things that they've done. However, what we would say is that I know you all as a board, and I know Rick and Lee want to have the best, most efficient and effective IAS operations that they can have. And that's going to take some money. I mean, if you're going to do it right and you're going to do it well, then there's going to need to be some investment in that process. And that's why we've made a lot of the recommendations that we have, and we feel like best practices calls for a lot of these things to happen if the board so chooses to head that direction. And it's going to take some money to do that, but we feel like that money would be very worthwhile spent. The last item, number 10, I already referred to kind of the analysis we did from looking at the Council of Great City Schools. I don't think there's the things that we noted that came out of there, again, technology related is some more technology resources, potentially outsourcing some projects. Again, most of them had an internal audit committee that they utilized. And we just feel like even though you're never going to compare apples to apples, IAS even doing this kind of analysis periodically, you're going to learn something, or you're going to find something out that'll help you as you continue to improve. So that's a brief overview of our report and recommendations.
Thank you, Mr. Finney. Before we ask for any questions or discussion, Mr. Barber, I know you had responses in the body of the report, but much like Mr. Finney just sort of hit a high-level executive summary, would you like to respond to any of those items kind of on a high level and share some feedback from your perspective?
Oh, sure. Thank you. On the auditing software, we're not opposed to using electronic work papers, and we have participated in several demos. But we would like to see, maybe Larry can show us exactly where the time savings is on those in that software. Because they they relate back to that's going to save us some time. So on the demos that we saw, we just were curious as to where it didn't really. It looks like the planning and field work and reporting, you still use Excel documents and you still put them into the software program. So we were wondering exactly where the time savings is. We agree with them as far as the hiring an IT auditor. And audit committee, we're not opposed to an audit committee. We had an audit committee in the past. And of course, training. We look like if we get the data mining software, each employee will have available training on that software. However, we'll need to increase the budget for training costs.
Okay. All right, so do we have any board members that have questions or comments? Mr. Shamlin?
You mentioned finding other school districts.
Is your mic on, Mr. Shamlin?
Sorry. You had mentioned finding other school districts similar to ours to compare with and compare notes and so forth, which seems to be a good idea. Another question I have is there such a committee, such another district in South Carolina? And does it need to be a South Carolina district that we sort of compare notes with?
The only other district I know of in South Carolina that has an internal audit group is Charleston County School District. However, I don't think it needs to be another South Carolina district. They basically, IAS follows the international internal auditing standards, and so it could very easily be another school district from North Carolina, Georgia, or wherever that's close enough in the southeast, probably.
Just off the surface, it would seem to be worthwhile to find somebody that has a pretty good operating procedure or process, whatever, to kind of see, how close we are, if at all, to what they're doing. And that obviously could be applied to other areas of the system as well.
Right.
You mentioned the internal audit committee. We have had one in the past. Can you elaborate on how that would work?
Sure. Well, so I know I know here at Greenville that you all used to have several committees, and you went to a committee of the whole, and I totally understand the benefits of doing that. However, with an internal audit committee, there's a couple things I think that could come out of that. One is just a little more hands-on oversight with IAS that I think would be helpful for them, both from the planning and risk assessment process of having, say, 3 board members. Our recommendation here was board officers and a couple administrative people as well, but obviously it could be made up of whoever you wanted it to be. But we feel like just a little more interaction going on a regular basis between the board members, administration, and IAS would be helpful. I think one of the challenges that I mentioned earlier that I think the internal audit committee could really help with is this just kind of general cultural thing going on in terms of there not being a lot of urgency in getting projects done. Also, the relationship between the district departments and IAS, I think, could be improved. And I think an internal audit committee could help drive some of those changes that we see as being needed.
Okay. And I guess the last one, I forgot where you mentioned it, but I thought I heard you say that the board is doing a good job of evaluating employees. And my recollection is the board only has 2 employees. You're not talking about the board evaluating other folks.
No, what I mentioned was, first of all, that they were doing evaluations, which is good. When I talked about the board only evaluates the CAE, and I said sometimes the board has done a good job with those evaluations, and then sometimes those evaluations have been weaker and could be improved. And that's where, again, we feel like the internal audit committee could probably help with that.
Okay. That's all I had. Thank you.
Mr. Lewis?
I appreciate all this information, and I think, Mr. Barber, what I read here is that things are going well, and that I think your team is doing a great job, and it seems like there are suggestions for how we could improve some of our processes to either make it more efficient or more effective, and so I appreciate all of you spending some time on it. I do wonder, there were 3 recommendations that kind of stood out to me that I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about, and
Okay.
my colleague talked a little bit about the audit committee, so I wonder if we could dive into that a little bit further. It appears to me that one of the advantages of having an internal audit committee would be that it would eliminate the need for the entire board to have a discussion about what audits should be added to a plan, because the audit committee could do that in a really a more intimate conversation and then bring
Correct.
a recommendation to the board rather than kind of parsing it all out here. I feel like that's kind of what one of the things you guys are getting at. Is that
I would agree, yes.
And Mr. Barber, it sounds like that you're comfortable with the idea of having an internal audit committee. You just didn't feel like you don't have the authority to create one because the board would create it. Is that?
Yes, sir. We had audit committee years ago, and I don't know how many years. We had it a long time, and it seemed like it worked well.
It seems like even particularly with the technology audit that we talked about, it would have provided an opportunity for a group of people to kind of work through a timeline rather than kind of holding up the approval of a plan
Right.
here. I just
And what we primarily presented, if I recall, it's been so long ago, but it's really, we presented our agenda to the audit committee that was going to be the agenda that would have been at the actual board meeting. There might have been some other issues that we
Sure.
added or so forth, but it pretty much dovetailed to the board meeting agenda.
But based on your experience, having an internal audit committee would not be an extra challenge for you. That you wouldn't object to that.
No, sir.
Okay. So I know we have a committee. I think Ms. Wells is now chairing that committee. So that'd just be my observation. Perhaps maybe that committee could look at that as a possible recommendation.
Well, I think we have
The current committee's for the evaluation.
we have one that's kind of working on an evaluation instrument, but that would not be the same as establishing a committee that would be structured to inform the work of the auditor. So, because what it would do is if you had an audit committee, the way it worked previously is we had an audit committee and work would go to the audit committee first. It would not have to go to the committee of the whole. It would bypass the committee of the whole and then go straight to the board, much like any other committee. So that would be a different, that's kind of outside the realm of what the committee that I'm chairing currently would cover.
So I just think we probably need to get. I believe that the purpose of that committee was changed to also include looking at board policy involving the internal auditing department.
So in that
And so-
purview, you could make that recommendation.
I would like it if this committee could just look at, is there a reason for an internal audit committee, and should the board explore that? Because I think we got clarification when Chairman Saylors formed this committee that it was both to look at the evaluation and to look at board policy
Board
changes
policy.
around the department.
Yeah, okay.
So I just would appreciate it. I think there's a good discussion that could be had around that. I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about this idea of outsourcing audits.
Okay.
I know we have, the board has gone back and forth around the value of having an internal employee doing audits or whether having, so I know you looked at other school districts that outsource some of their audits. So could you maybe just talk a little bit further about maybe what you see are advantages of that and maybe what we should look for, maybe possible challenges with that?
Sure. Obviously, there are advantages and disadvantages to both of them. What we noted when we looked at that Council of Great City Schools and what some of them were doing is you had a little bit of everything. So, for example, I know there were a couple school districts that IAS was not doing any of the individual pupil activity work. That was getting outsourced. The internal IAS was doing everything else. In some cases, IAS was outsourcing projects where maybe they didn't feel like they had the enough of an expertise in an area, and so they would go find somebody that could help them. That's where we primarily saw most of the outsourcing. So the benefit of the outsourcing from our perspective is primarily the second one, where you may decide, for example, an example would be, I know this was done differently in this case, but when you had your IT assessment done here at the school district, that could have been done under the auspices of IAS, and IAS could have said, okay, we're just going to outsource that, but it's going to be part of the IAS overall master plan. That would be an example. So I think the primary benefit is twofold, is either when you don't have the expertise in-house, or number two, you have just decided that what you want to do is you want to keep your overall IAS staff to a minimum level, maybe to primarily do school projects and maybe a couple others. And if you end up doing more projects than that, rather than hire somebody because you don't necessarily need them full-time all the time, there's another project out there, you want to get it done, but you're going to outsource it instead. So it can kind of help keep your ongoing recurring cost to a certain level, and then where there are special projects, you can outsource it, or you can decide that there are just certain things that are always going to get outsourced.
So in the first example that you gave, it sounds like so this department could focus its auditing work on the entire district's operations and then contract out when an individual school needs to have something audited. Is that what you're talking about?
Generally, yeah.
What activity funds or things like that?
Yeah. What I would say here, I think it really, to me, I think one of the things that I think probably needs to be done here at a high level is maybe even revisiting the charter that you have, because in essence, when you look at the charter here, it calls for IAS to do a lot of school work, pupil activity work. At this point, if you really sit down and risk assess Greenville County School District, I'm not sure that you would want to pour all the resources into the school work that you are right now, especially with the good job they're doing with the continuous monitoring of the pupil activity. When fraud happens, yep, they need to go investigate, they need to look at it. When they do that continuous monitoring, when they see something that doesn't look right, that's out of whack, yep, go take a look at it. But otherwise, we would almost say, maybe we don't need to do so much schoolwork. Maybe we need to look at things a little bit different from an enterprise risk management standpoint. But that would take revisiting the charter the way it's written right now.
Mr. Barber, anything you'd add or clarify in any of that, particularly around the idea of outsourcing audits?
I know over the years, the student activity funds seemed like there was the greatest risk, so that's where we concentrated a lot of audit resources too. But yeah, there's some things with investment technology and so forth, and in certain areas that we don't have the expertise that we could outsource. Certainly would consider that.
Thanks. The last question I think actually gets to this. There are several recommendations that have to do with technology, and I know you've acknowledged that some of those investments require money.
Yes.
So I know you've given us a good list of priorities here, but if there was maybe one or two technology investments that you think we should really start with, are there any that kind of rise on this list as priorities?
Absolutely. No question. I think the sooner that you can find a staff person that has good technology skills, that's going to pay dividends big time. I think number two, you already have the ACL data mining software, so it's really just a matter of getting more licenses and getting trained on it, and you already own it, so you could start really using that. I would say staff one, ACL two, in software engagement work paper software would be number three.
Okay. Mr. Barber, I saw in your comments that the staff didn't seem to be a concern for you, except that you've budgeted for a position and you would anticipate this would have additional cost. Do you have anything that you'd add kind of for the board to consider around staffing a technology?
Initially, we thought it was just going to be a pure information technology auditor, and those folks command about $80,000 to $100,000, and they're very difficult to find. And I think in the report was revised where they recommended a staff auditor with IT experience. So we would agree with that, and we were hoping that we might be able to possibly fill that position with the current budget. However, we also think it might be a small increase, maybe a $10,000 increase potentially, but it wouldn't be as great as it was initially. So we have the budgeted funds for a staff auditor. So if we could possibly get that person with that particular range, that would be great. If not, it might cost us a little bit more.
So do you know, like if we were, I know that we're kind of into a year, so you have more funds available perhaps than you would in a typical year because we haven't filled that position. But if this was a 12-month budget for the position the way you envision it, what do you think is roughly the difference between what the board has currently approved and what you think we would need for a full year of moving this position from a traditional auditor to an auditor with this level of expertise? I mean, are we talking $20,000? Is that?
Yeah, probably 10 to 20.
Okay. So you believe that possibly we could fill that position this year because we still have an unfilled position and we're in September, but as the board looks to next year, we're talking about a $20,000 difference in your budget would allow us to continue that? Is that
potentially 10 to
okay.
15 or so. We're not really sure. It depends on what the market bears for that.
Okay.
I mean, that position now is just for a regular financial auditor, so an IT auditor might command a little bit more money.
Okay. And then I think we talked about ACL.
ACL, the data mining.
And that, I don't remember your responses to that, so can you just remind me what?
Yeah, what we wanted to do with that is buy 3 additional license agreements, and that would cost just $5,000. And there's also some continuing education courses in there to teach you how to use it.
Okay.
So the training's also included in that, and that would give us 4 license agreements, and we would have 4 people. So we could fulfill our investment technology skills because those classes they have continuing education in those training.
Okay. Well, I appreciate all of y'all for your time. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Mr. Sailors?
Rick, just to be clear, you're saying to get the 3 additional licenses for ACL, is that the right word?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Is 5,000 total or per?
Yes,
or
sir.
Per license?
5,000 total.
Okay, and then $20,000 to high end, $20,000 additional dollars to get the right person for the right job for this open position that you've got over and above what you already have budgeted.
Yes, sir.
And then, Larry, the other software that you're recommending, If we were to purchase that, it would cost roughly how much?
I'm not sure. I think Rick might have done some initial investigation into that, to at least have an idea of what he's looking at there. By the way, Mr. Sailors, one other thing I would add to those numbers
Yes.
you got the 5,000 for the licenses, you got 20,000 tops for the staff position. I think there also needs to be some additional amount there on the training side too, both for
I'm getting there.
ACL and otherwise. Okay.
I'm getting there.
All right.
Thank you.
Good.
So, Rick, let's just say for discussion's sake, the additional software is 20 grand? I mean, we spent millions on one software.
Well,
20
yeah,
grand's pocket
that's
change.
millions, yeah. That's after I thought about it. You know, I says, gosh, they spend millions of dollars on software, and this is pretty cheap. But we really looked at two, Audit Prodigy, and that was just under $40,000 a year. And we also looked at Teammate, which there's a lot of internal audit groups that are using that. There's a one-time fee of $20,000 and an annual cost of $13,500.
Okay.
So we talked to a number of internal audit departments that are using Teammate.
Okay. And related training, if you wanted to send your staff to the training for ACL or any other items that you feel that's important to your operations, what's an approximate budget?
We figured out out-of-county training for 4 people at $4,300 per auditor. That's $17,200.
Okay, so I'm going to be gracious. We're going to say $20,000. So that is, according to my math, 85 grand for the entire package. That would get us from point A to point B. Dr. Royster, since this is the board's budget that the internal auditor operates through, do we have the ability to reprogram the funds to make this happen?
Come out within the Board of Trustees line item.
Yes, sir.
You'd probably be pretty stretched to do it within that. What I would suggest, if I kept tally correctly, we're going to come to you all in probably about 2 months and recommend some purchases from fund balance.
Yes, sir.
About $70,000 of that, 70 to 80,000 would be non-recurring. That'd be the purchases.
Three of the items would be non-recurring.
That'd be the purchase of the software. I guess those additional licenses are a one-time cost.
That's
That-
annual.
That's an annual cost. Well, it could be covered by the first year through fund balance. And then there was about $18,000 for one-time training.
That's
I would-
annual. That's annual also.
But the
But
initial year.
it would
with
get
the
you
initial
through
year.
the initial year. I would recommend that it be done through fund balance so as not to impair the rest of your budget, which is pretty, as you know, it's pretty tight with the trainings that you all undertake, the School Boards Association and so forth. That to me would be the logical way to do it. And then it could be programmed into the general fund budget, those recurring line items for the FY21 general fund budget. That would be my
You'll
suggestion.
start working on the 2021 budget in January.
January, and whatever you all approved, we would, enter that into the budget draft that would come to you for approval for FY21.
So you will take the consensus of this conversation and move forward accordingly?
If the consensus of the board is to provide you that recommendation as part of the fund balance and to include it in the budget, certainly. Because knowing that you all have to come back and vote on both of those things.
Correct.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Is that it, Mr. Sailors?
That's it. Thank you, ma'am.
Awesome. Do I have other questions or comments? Ms. Morrison-Fair?
I would just like a little clarification on that additional purchase. That's $20,000 in addition to what you have budgeted for that position? And what is the budget for that position, for that new technology person?
I had it. I think it was. I think that position was between 43 and 65,000.
And that's an additional $20,000 on top of that.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Is that Ms. Morrison-Fair?
Get with your baby.
All right. Anyone else have any questions? Okay. So we're taking action now with Committee of the Whole, which will come to the board in 2 weeks. Mr. Barber, could you, between now and then, oh, you're right, this was it, isn't it? Yeah, that's right. Okay, so I get, Mr. Webb, help me out. So what I'm wondering to Mr. Saylor's, we're all kind of sitting here and figuring on the back of an envelope and using numbers. Would I need to make a motion to ask our auditor to provide a summary of budgeted items he would like to see us budget and purchase to move forward with implementing some of these recommendations and improvements to bring to the board meeting in 2 weeks? Or is this, can we have enough of a conversation to?
I envision this as well, that the board would, the motion is to accept the recommendation and report. And then from there, I think it's incumbent on the board to then create a plan from there, whether it be budgetary or forming a committee or having, the current ad hoc committee to review some items. I don't know if there needs to be a second step budgetary-wise from bringing Finney
No. I was specifically thinking for Mr. Barber.
Madam Chair, could I offer a clarification?
Sure.
I mean, it's my understanding that if you accept the motion as accepting the report, if you will, these topics are a component of that report. And so I think the internal audit department, the external auditor, and the administration all understand the next steps. As far as I'm concerned, this is just me personally, to Mr. Lewis's point earlier, the committee that's already in place has the latitude, the flexibility to include the conversation about an audit committee. So that's taken care of. We have in this report a list of items that have been recommended. All parties agree that they need to move forward. So if we accept the report, would that not include all of those moving pieces?
I agree. I think that my recommendation would be there are other avenues that the board, the administration, and internal auditing can work together on in effectuating these recommendations that have been accepted by the board. So I agree with Mr. Saylor.
Oh my God.
Okay, so
Lawyers agreeing with me.
I'm thinking about if we're asking, to Dr. Royster's point, if we don't take an action we're accepting the report because the report are recommendations and findings, but that doesn't translate into 6 actions. Okay?
Correct.
So if we're going to get to actions, then this body needs to take some I understood that this body would need to take some specific action to, for instance, direct the superintendent to say we want to spend fund balance on a certain amount. So trying to get to something more specific in terms of, Mr. Barber, provide us a report that outlines, so he's responded to each one of these individual. Okay, next step is a plan to put in place whatever these improvements are with cost associated with them, that then the board could deal with that plan. So yeah, we're accepting the audit just like we always accept audits, but we've never accepted an audit that actually had some action affecting budget inside of it that automatically said, okay, well then we've approved a budget change. So that's where I'm getting. Now, I'm fine with putting it on a future board agenda, and certainly if I'll read the charge of it again. I didn't understand that we could go past policy and evaluation tool on the committee, the subcommittee, because I'm taking that over from Ms. Leventis Wells as vice chairman. But certainly, if you're saying there's latitude within that committee to parse some of this out, then we can do so.
For the audit committee, I believe that could be embedded within the policy or policy changes and review, and then for a later discussion with the Board of Trustees after the committee.
But the budget piece.
Well, and that was one matter that Dr. Royster said, if that was the unanimous discussion, that would be still left for another vote by the board in a couple
Yeah,
months.
kind
So
of
if
the
Mr.
point-
Barber provided to the administration some outline of, based on this report, here's the budget adjustments and the monies that we believe are needed.
We still have to take action on that.
Just the
Right.
cost part would have to come back to you all.
Yeah, we
for
got to
action.
take action on that anyway.
It might offer a a concern, thought, whatever, and then a suggestion.
I wanted you to do that, so as soon
Okay.
as I clear up with Doug. So if I said, in this case, Mr. Barber, I guess what I hear is Mr. Barber can provide that report of, here's what we believe, based on these findings, we might need in terms of budget adjustments. He provides that to the administration, then the administration can include that into fund balance recommendations in 2 months.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, clear. Okay, thank you. Okay, so, and Dr. Royster, I'm glad you said that, because I did want to get some feedback from the administration standpoint, because there are interactions between the board, IS, and the administration. So, yeah, could you provide some
Yeah,
feedback to us?
since we're the ones to be studied on this, or analyzed or audited. And this might offer an opportunity to kind of jump to the suggestion first. Since you have this committee established to deal with the internal auditor, perhaps that's an opportunity for that committee to work with the administration, with the external auditor, and with the internal auditor to maybe flesh out some of those recommendations and give us an opportunity to have some input on that. Because one of the questions that immediately comes to mind, if you talk about getting someone with IT experience, for example, and Mr. Barber made this point, well, we got some very experienced IT people in IT, and we struggle to find people there. But to find someone that has the depth of knowledge that matches our IT people, and they have the finance background or the accounting background, be very difficult. And one of the root issues, and it was mentioned earlier about there's a high level of communication, I think, in trust between the schools and internal auditing. And then there might not be to such a degree with departments. And one of the key reasons for that, I believe, is when IA goes to a school, they're auditing routine financial transactions. Everybody understands what they are. Everybody understands how they're to be done. Everybody understands the rules by which you do them. When internal auditing branches out and begins to audit things that go outside the realm of pure financial transactions, and they're into departmental areas where there are people in there with a highly developed skill set in that arena, their skill set or knowledge level may not be, IAs may not be equal to that department's knowledge of their subject matter. And therein lies the establishment of this little bit of distrust, discontent, a little bit of fear. I see there is not his head. I think he understands exactly what I'm saying. It's when you begin to get into areas beyond your training as an accountant or an auditor that then there becomes a little bit of concern. And so when you start specializing in audits, then we walk that line of, well, does that person have the knowledge of the subject area? In other words, they could go out to construction and they could audit the financial transactions of how we do payouts on construction projects. But on the other hand, they would not have the level of expertise to go in there and assure that our engineers were properly engineering the structure of the project, as an example. And there would be examples, whether it has to do with a reading program or a building program, where their level of knowledge never will, nor should it, match the experts in that subject area. So that's an area to improve, I think, communications and relationships, but also an area where we ought to, I think, look at, if we want to audit that area, we need to, as we did with technology, we need to bring in a third party that's an expert in that, if we believe there's a programmatic audit to be done there. But I think that might offer an opportunity if that committee's focus could either be expanded or if it's interpreted as such, that we could sit down as 4 entities and work together to help improve the relationships and improve the function of internal auditing, and not walk away, because we don't need to walk away from the risk we have with people handling money. Because that's the biggest risk we have, and the one that creates the greatest, or could create the greatest lack of trust with our community if we're not out there, as Rick and those so ably do, checking to make sure that our financial risk in cash transaction is as minimal as it can be. And they do a very effective job of helping to ensure that because of all the student activity funds audits they do. But now there are also high-level transactions we do that we want to make sure that we're giving attention to them as well, that are certainly within the realm of expertise and knowledge of accountants and auditors. So, for example, we just did a bond sale. Is there something around that we need to look at? We just completed one this morning.
Okay. All right, thank you. Are there any other comments from the group? Okay. Yes, ma'am, Ms. Goodwin Caldwell.
Since he needs that person, how long is this process going to take us? Is what I'm asking, because I mean, if we could go on and move it forward in order for him to go on and get that person for his department, but if we go through all of this other stuff, how long is this process going to take?
Well, he already has an open position right now.
Right, but we have to.
So in terms of how we allocate FTEs in a salary range, we can probably.
The amount of money that Mr. Barber's talking about, and the fact that it's now September, and by the time he gets the person hired, it'll be October. I mean, reasonable.
Right.
It'll be October, that's not a problem.
Because it's an
That wouldn't be
FTE
a
in a
problem.
salary range.
It's a 1
okay.
and it's a 1.0 FTE for a full year.
Oh, okay.
So if
Because
it
I was
gets come
just
within a few $1,000s, that's just not an issue.
okay. I was just wondering if if we have to circumvent all of this other stuff in order to get him that person, should we go on and do that? Okay. All right. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. So since Ms. Leventis Wells is chairman and she isn't here today, I certainly will follow up with her on the role of the committee and what we can address there. And if that committee cannot address some of these items, then certainly she can bring that back to the board at the board meeting and have that discussion. Are there any other comments or any other concerns, questions before we vote on the motion? All right, so the motion we have on the floor. Let's see. Is to accept the report and findings from Green Finney with the included responses provided by Internal Auditing Services. All in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? The motion carries. That is the only item we have on our agenda for the day. So,
Ms. Wells, can I just make one more comment as
Yes,
we finish up? And I just want to publicly thank Rick and Lee because we were invading their space for a long time. And whenever we needed something, they got it for us. They were great to work with. And Rick and Lee, thank you for all your help.
You're welcome.
yeah, well, and I think that's a point well taken. I think Mr. Barber said it himself in one of his responses. No one likes to be audited, right? Right. So we appreciate the work that you guys have done collectively, and the cooperation of the administration in bringing us something that we're going to be able to move forward and do a better job in everything that we're doing as it relates to auditing. So thank you, Mr. Sailors.
Madam Chair, I'm going to make a motion to adjourn.
Have a motion. Do I have a second? Is there any discussion? All in favor of adjournment, please say aye. Any opposed? The motion carries. We are adjourned. Yeah, I promise you can do something.
What did you promise?